Today we will be playing another game on the shores of Pelagia. So, we've got our cards. We've got the coral hilts that we have collected from our previous adventures. And let's begin. So, when we think about the way that we are exploring this world, a lot of it is happening in our imagination, but it doesn't have to. We would be able to produce a map, and it could look something like this, or it could simply be drawn on your table, handed out between friends, or again, still in your collective imagination. Truthfully, the visuals help, but are not necessary for the game to be able to be played and enjoyed by as many people as you are participating with. Now, a great example is bringing a prop in that allows somebody to feel like they are participating in the game and holding something that their character would be holding, but not necessarily needing it to be a full immersive experience. People, the less that they have, the more their imagination works, and truthfully, the more fun that they have. But in this video, I'll be giving some visual prompts that'll help describe what is happening. So when we left off, we had just gone back into the Marrow hideout. We have now explored even deeper into this coral forest and actually discovered the ally who we had been sent to rescue, and they are held prisoner. So that ally held prisoner is actually at the end of a long cavern, and I'll show you a visual representation of it now. But if you look a little bit closer, you'll see that there are paths leading into this cavern. We emerged out of one, and as we entered, a voice rang out and said, "Ah, my God will be pleased, for there is more prey to feed on." So, with that, we would all draw initiative, and we previously discussed this, but each player would pull out 5 cards, and the GM would pull out 5 cards. And we now have poker hands for everybody on the table, and we would go from descending order of poker hands first, all the way to the bottom for round 1. Now, if at any point a player decides, they can play one of their cards as an action card instead, and so I'll show you what we just drew. So we have a player, a GM-controlled PC, and the sea witch who emerged from the water. So the player drew this. You have 2 9s, and that's the poker hand. The GM-controlled PC drew a 2 pair, so 2 4s and 2 8s. That's a good poker hand to start. However, the Sea Witch drew 2 pair as well, 2 2s and 2 jacks. So the order is going to be the Sea Witch, then the GM-controlled player, then the player themselves. So, initiative started. What are we going to do? Well, the Sea Witch is going to attack using this pair of jacks. So she has this pair of jacks, and she could use the pair of 2s as well, but this will be easier to be countered. So 2 jacks. The Sea Witch is going to attack the player with her 2 jacks. Now, unfortunately, if we remember, the player only has 2 9s as their hand. So the player can either choose to use one of these cards or tell the GM, "I'd like to take a chance." And they will draw a single card to try and counter a jack. They have to beat a jack or they will take a damage. It's a 3. So the player, lightning, I'll show you a visual. The Sea Witch emerges holding a cone. There's crystals all glowing through a shell like this, and she holds it forward and it glows, and this bright white light just emerges and shocks the player into a paralysis. They cannot move unless they beat the equivalent of a jack on their next turn as a check to break out of that paralysis. Now, the player has the ability to shake that off during their turn, but it's not their turn yet. It's actually the GM-controlled PC. His name is Lucian. He is a Coral Knight who has been captured by the marrow. Now, he drew 2 pair, and I'm going to allow that a dramatic action, such as emerging from a place like this, you can hand in your whole poker hand. So that's a good poker hand. Now, if he was going to make an attack, he could use his 2 8s, he could use his 2 4s, but he's trying to make a dramatic escape. So I'm going to let him use his entire poker hand, and he plays his hand. And though he's not holding a hilt, because of the energy and the intensity of the situation, he actually is able to shape ice around the guarded cage and the ice that forms. He shoves his shoulder into it, and so basically by doing this, he used his 8s for 1 action to create the ice, and then his pair of 4s for a second action. So he got to take 2 actions where he actually bashes his way free of the cage. So Lucien has now escaped from his cage and is standing in front of you as the player and going, "Shake that off. We need to beat her. Let's get this going." And so the player now has their hand, but because they cannot beat, so they have their hand, they could play their queen to beat the paralysis check. So that's what they're going to do, because remember, they were trying to beat a pair of jacks. So they'll play their queen, and you are now, as the player, emerged from this situation. You shook it off, and you have an action that you can take. You can throw a pair of 9s, and so remember, you're holding your coral hilt, which allows you to turn this into a sword, or to fire it like a laser pistol. So, we're going to use our pair of 9s for a laser pistol stack. So the player with the pair of 9s fires at the Sea Witch, but the Sea Witch pulls her king. So this electric shock builds within your lightning pistol, and you fire, and the Sea Witch, holding this forward, actually absorbs the electric energy into her crystal and laughs and says, "You can't use electricity to beat me. Who do you think I am? My God would never allow that." So that's the end of turn 1. Now, the Sea Witch has 2 2s left. The player has a 5 and a 10 left. And Lucien, the DMPC, has no cards left. So, because we're still in that first round, the Sea Witch can go until the end of the poker hand, and then the player can go, and then everyone would redraw for the dramatic encounter. So the Sea Witch, with her 2 2s, she's pretty confident she's not going to be able to hit you with this weak foot attack. So it's just going to use this action to position herself more accordingly, and to actually yell out, "Roderick, it's time." Now the player's going to use a 10. There's a marrow guard that's standing nearby. The 10, they're going to use to attack the marrow guard. And I'll draw for the marrow guard to be able to resist a 10. It's a 2. The marrow guard is dead, and you've now killed one of her guards. Now, with your 5 left, you can attack another marrow guard, which you will. Can it resist a 5? It did. This is an ace. It resisted it, and now there's an ace of clubs, which means that there's a very interesting complication that comes in. We've been fighting one Sea Witch and some small marrow guards, but as her voice rings out, another voice. "Ah, my love, is it time?" And as you see this marrow captain come through, and he's actually holding a massive coral hilt with a huge ice blade that emerges out of it as he steps out of the water and onto the shore. And Roderick, his voice ringing out, laughs and says, "I figured it was time, but I'm here to end you, Lucien." And so his coral hilt emerging with ice. Lucien, as a free action, grabs the coral hilt that you had picked up from the table, and his coral hilt emerges and becomes this huge ice sword as well. And now the 2 coral knights, while we are fighting the Sea Witch, the 2 coral knights are dueling it out for each other. So for the sake of this video, they won't be drawing cards. It will be you versus Sea Witch, but in a normal encounter, every wild card would get a poker hand, and they would each have their actions. So let's draw again, this time for the player, and this time for the Sea Witch. So the player drew a pair of kings. And the Sea Witch drew a pair of queens. Kings go first. So as the player, we're rushing forward to now strike at this Sea Witch. As a reminder, she resisted the electric attack, so we're going to try and use an ice sword. So we pull out our original coral hilt, and a long sword appears out of ice. And we're throwing our 2 kings as our action to strike at the Sea Witch, and we score a very clean blow. We slice through her shoulder into her chest, and she screams out in pain and recoils, and electricity charges out of that shell again as she throws 2 queens at us. And we take this electric shock, and we howl in pain, but we're both still alive and still up. We've each taken 1 wound. The kings and the sword attack was a wound. The queens and that attack was a wound. If we attack with less than a 10 and the player doesn't resist it, while they've taken a wound, they will take another one. But if I had previously thrown a 10 at this and she had resisted it, there would be no wound. Or she could have used her queens as her defensive maneuver to prevent that from becoming a wound. But she's angry. She wants to attack us. So now, this is the queen's hand, and this is the player's hand. We're going to go 1 action at a time to see who attacks and what happens, in what order. Now, neither of these strikes are going to result in any damage taken, so these narratively would just become, I feint and I attack Marrow Guard. She blinds your ally, Lucian, and assists with the other piece. So there's a lot of narrative weight happening here, but truthfully, nothing from a combat perspective is going to change it. So we're just going to pretend that we've used these cards now to narrate the fight, and we'll redraw for the player all 5 cards. The player got a pair of 10s. And the Sea Witch drew a pair of aces. Sea Witch goes first, uses these 2 aces. The whole chamber fills with electricity. Everyone except for Roderick is now paralyzed. For a brief moment, you feel like you can resist this until you're no longer able to move. Sea Witch and Roderick swim a little ways back. Blood is still pouring from the Sea Witch. Roderick has taken a few blows from Lucian, and Lucian himself, as you see him electrocuted and frozen, Lucian himself is still up and breathing, but frozen in this moment. And the Sea Witch and Roderick swim away, and we'll have to find them another time. They escaped with their lives in this encounter, but so did you, and you've rescued Lucian, and you can return to the Keepers, having completed your mission, though the threat itself has not been taken care of. Now, this has been another round of Pelagia, and in a world where you had the ability to continue this action and continue this session, we would chase after the Sea Witch and the other wild card who emerged, but for the sake of this tutorial, hopefully everyone here had a good time, understood what it was that we were hoping to accomplish with this action, and was able to visualize both the weapons that the enemies were using, as well as the weapons that your ally was using, and that you yourself were using. Thank you all so much. I'm going back to Pelagia.